Commander Dax Kalthraxus prided himself on his ability to read warriors. Scales, feathers, chitin, it mattered little. The language of tactics was universal. It lay in the set of a jaw, the angle of a gaze lingering just a touch too long on a simulated terrain map, which is what drew him to the human designated as Sergeant Lee. Everyone agreed that humans were enigmas. Reckless, brilliant, unpredictable, words often whispered in the echoing corridors of the Federation HQ. Dax, a veteran of a dozen border skirmishes himself, sensed something else amidst the chaos. Discipline, forged in a crucible far hotter than any simulator could replicate. "Your perimeter is vulnerable here," he rumbled, gesturing towards a holographic hill on the display. Lee, a deceptively unimposing figure beside Dax's scaled bulk, didn't flinch. He simply analyzed the terrain, his eyes narrowing in focus. "Standard fortified position is a death trap, sir," Lee countered, his voice surprisingly deep for a creature of his size. "High ground advantage is nullified by urban density. The enemy could burrow, bypass, or—" He trailed off meaningfully. Intrigued, Dax ran a simulation overlay, adjusting for the unknown Thrax capabilities Lee hinted at. The results were unsettling. The neat defensive lines bled into ambush zones. "Improvisation," he rasped, more to himself than the human. Lee's mouth twitched into a semblance of a smile. "Necessity, sir. We weren't fighting by some rulebook. Thrax had numbers, tech. We had—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Spite, maybe. And a whole planet of crumbling cities to use against them." Dax felt the cold thrill of a strategist encountering a truly worthy foe. "Tell me," he ordered, suddenly eager, "how does one weaponize spite?" What followed was unlike any tactical briefing Dax had ever endured. It wasn't clean theory, but gritty, blood-soaked pragmatism. Lee spoke of booby-trapping hospitals to deny vital resources to the enemy, collapsing overpasses to turn avenues into choke points of civilians. The weak, the frail, who became bait, distraction, human sacrifices in a desperate bid to buy time. Each ruthlessly efficient tactic made Dax's scales prickle in a mix of revulsion and grudging admiration. This wasn't war as he knew it. It was the relentless logic of a cornered predator. The galaxy's rules of engagement be damned. It was terrifyingly effective. "And this," Lee concluded, highlighting a ruined cityscape pockmarked with craters, "is where the Federation simulators fail. They make war too neat, too predictable." He met Dax's multifaceted gaze. "You want to truly understand how we fought? You'll need more than terrain maps and casualty statistics." "More?" Dax echoed the word, a low rasp in his throat. His tail twitched in agitation. The human was right. Based on centuries of codified warfare, their sterile simulations were woefully inadequate regarding this strange species. To comprehend them was to dive into the darkness they'd crawled out of. And yet, the lure of it was irresistible. "Show me," he demanded. "Not on a screen, but in your memories. A true warrior's education lies in the battles burned into his mind." Lee hesitated, a flicker of shadow crossing his face. The bio readouts indicated a spike in adrenaline, a visceral echo of remembered trauma. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier bravado, becoming quieter and haunted. "There are things you wouldn't want to see, sir. Things no being should." The words were laced with a plea for understanding that Dax, raised on the battle hymn of his own people, could barely fathom. Yet a strange flicker of kinship sparked within him. Wasn't he, too, the product of his wars, his scales bearing the marks of conflicts that had honed him into the strategist he was today? To truly understand an enemy, one had to look beyond the victories and into the abyss, Sergeant, Dax said slowly, consciously softening the harsh edge of his usual command tone. I have seen battlefields that turned my stomachs. I have smelled the blood rot of dying worlds. War is universal. Show me yours, and let me judge what I can endure. Something shifted within the human. A muscle in his jaw relaxed, and in his eyes, defiance mingled with a desperate sort of trust. Fair enough, he muttered. Then, with a few deft gestures that belied his inner turmoil, Lee switched the display from Federation standard schematics to something more personal, more raw. Images flickered into focus. Not sterile landscapes, but half-destroyed structures that were painfully, agonizingly familiar to anyone who'd grown up on a densely populated planet. There were flashes of movement, of grotesque alien shapes, of detonations that sent shockwaves across the screen, making the very air in Dax's observation chamber hum. Yet, the horror wasn't just in the enemy, but the humans themselves. In hollowed-out eyes that had witnessed atrocities. In a woman, barely past being a child, wielding a crude flamethrower with chilling focus. The split-second decisions painted across Lee's face weighed the lives of the few against the many. It was war stripped of glory, reduced to its brutal core. When the last image faded, leaving the sterile chamber cloaked in an uncomfortable silence, Dax felt more than disgust. He felt the echo of Lee's grim pragmatism seeping into his scales. A reminder that the lines of acceptable warfare were drawn in shifting sands. You were right, he admitted finally. Our simulators, they are inadequate. He fixed the young human with his multifaceted gaze. We need to change that. Your war, Sergeant Lee, will be a case study for every Federation strategist. The lesson the galaxy desperately needs. It will be a deterrent. Lee said nothing for a long moment, just stared at the now blank display as if the ghosts of his battles still lingered. Then, quietly, so quietly that Dax had to strain to hear, he said, "Let's hope they learn the damn lesson before having to fight their own version of the Thrax." Dax stood tall, his scaled form casting a long shadow across the observation chamber. The echo of Lee's final words hung in the air, a plea, a warning, and a challenge, all twisted into one. Change and adaptation were now vital, not merely for victory, but for the survival of the complacency that had settled upon the Federation. They will learn, Sergeant, he said, his voice resonating with a determination that surprised even himself. Perhaps not easily, but they will learn. A sliver of hope flickered in Lee's haunted eyes, quickly replaced by his usual stoic mask. For all our sakes, sir, I hope you're right. He hesitated, then executed a surprisingly crisp salute. The first acknowledgement Dax had received from the human that felt rooted in genuine respect. Later, as Dax reviewed Lee's battle record's relentless brutality, a plan began to coalesce within his strategic mind. It was unorthodox and potentially career-ending if the soft delegates of the Federation Council discovered his true purpose. But the galaxy, with the disturbing echo of human ruthlessness now etched in his mind, needed a rude awakening. He summoned one of his most trusted lieutenants, a cunning tactician known for her audacious maneuvers. It was time, he decided, to inject the Federation's simulations with a lethal dose of reality. The Thrax were an unknown entity, vanished from the galactic scene. But the humans, their desperation, honed into a terrifying weapon. They were a threat any intelligent species would be wise to heed. The games were about to become far more dangerous. The what-ifs would no longer be based on theoretical foes, but on the very real and unsettling species that now dwelt among them. Lee's war, a brutal testament to the unpredictable horror of survival, was about to become a curriculum no Federation strategist could afford to ignore. It might break some, but it would sharpen the rest. Or so he fervently hoped. He owed the humans that much. Even if he suspected they, of all the species aboard this glittering station, would understand his gamble better than anyone else.